The night they came, Operation Jock Scott and Kenyatta's arrest October 21, 1952, a cool, dark night north of Nairobi. Dust hung in the torchlight like smoke, men in khaki moved in the shadows, boots clopping on dirt, each step measured, each breath a small cloud in the lamp beam. A single-engine Dakota had landed hours earlier, and British troops tired, alert, and wired with the urgency of orders and loaded metal trunks, rifles, boxes of handcuffs, and sealed envelopes that smelled faintly of engine oil and old paper. Above them, the radio crackled with the governor's voice through static. Sign the emergency order. Sweep the towns. Take the leaders. They called it Operation Jock Scott. Jomo Kenyatta was waiting in a small screening station, a fragile human figure under harsh electric light. He had come to Nairobi from his home in Kikuyu country to answer to a rising storm. By then, the colonial administration had linked a growing pattern of oaths, raids, and ambushes what they labeled the Mau Mau to a single name the public feared and the papers called the leading spirit. Men in double-breasted suits and polished shoes had circled the governor's office for weeks. The new governor, Evelyn Baring, had decided that removing a voice could still a movement. That night, the files and the orders moved like a physical thing, stamped, rubber-stamped, and passed from one gloved hand to the next. The arrest itself was not a moment of shouting and struggle. It was quieter and more efficient to detectives, a military escort, the soft click of handcuffs. They told him he was under arrest for managing a prescribed society. The words were formal. The fear was not just for him, but for all the Kikuyu who would wake to find men gone from their homes. Outside, lorries moved through the sleeping estates toward the town center. Windows stayed shut, dogs did not bark. In the official record, the arrest sat beneath neat paragraphs, suspected links, alleged oaths, names of witnesses. In the towns and farms, the name Kenyatta slid into whispers. The British had rehearsed contingency. Troops flown in from regimented garrisons were already patrolling Nairobi's segregated quarters. Armored vehicles kicked up red dirt as they traced routes from the airfield to colonial bungalows. The emergency regulations were inked into existence that very evening. By dawn, dozens of leading nationalists and local chiefs had been rounded up across Central Province and in Nairobi itself. The intention was swift containment, decapitate the movement, frighten the rest into silence. That was the theory. The name for the sweep operation Jock Scott remained engraved in the dispatches that followed. They did not carry him straight to a courtroom. Instead, Kenyatta and several other leaders were moved through a sequence engineered to confuse and to isolate. First to Nairobi, then to remote holding points in the north, places chosen for their distance and their anonymity towns with names that sounded like the end of maps. The colonial authorities believed detention in distant camps and the spectacle of a trial would prove the state's control. They imagined that without his public presence, Kenyatta's influence would wither like a plant with its stem cut. They did not imagine how names can become louder when you try to silence them. Inside the screening station, the air tasted of sweat and lemon soap. Guards stamped their post orders onto crisp paper. Kenyatta's hands were steady. He watched the men who had come for him, some young, some with faces like old maps, cataloged the items on a small metal table. A packet of letters, a worn Bible, papers folded and annotated. A photograph of his family. He listened to footsteps outside as the compound shifted into that strange administrative silence when a colony recalibrates to an emergency. He knew the charge. He had long known the danger of being a public voice in a land where land itself was the argument. Across the province, the first arrests sent a different kind of message. Not the neat public message the governor wanted, but a private one inside markets, churches, and schools. Young men who had never met Kenyatta before began to say his name as if invoking a promise. The accused leader's absence was, paradoxically, a thread that drew people closer. Farmers who had tilled the same earth for decades spoke of Uhuru in the same breath as planting and rain freedom as a near, physical thing. Messages, rumors, the slow transmission of resolve moved faster than any military convoy. Where the British expected to see fear, they found instead a spreading murmur that sounded, in many places, like the first notes of a chorus. By the time the sun cut through the morning haze and the lorries retreated to barracks, Kenyatta was no longer just a man in custody. He had been folded into a larger story, one the colonial press tried to shape and one the people who would later call themselves freedom fighters were already rewriting. His name would be placed on trial papers, headlines, and propaganda leaflets. It would also begin to travel in the mouths of farmers, school teachers, and the men who met in thickets to rehearse a new kind of resistance. The British thought that by taking him, they had removed the head of the movement. That night proved only that you cannot put an idea in chains without it finding lungs. The trial at Kapenguria, turning a prison into a platform, December 1952. Kapenguria, a dusty administrative outpost near Kenya's western border, surrounded by rolling scrubland and guarded by a perimeter of wire and silence. The British had chosen it precisely for that reason, remote enough to control, empty enough to forget. But over the coming months, this quiet town would become the beating heart of a colonial drama that caught the world's attention. 6 men sat in the dock, but only one mattered to the headlines: Jomo Kenyatta, president of the Kenya African Union. Around him were Achingo Neko, Kamu Karumba, Paul Ngei, Bildad Kagia, and Fred Kubai. The colonial press called them the Kapenguria Six. Their charge was organizing and managing the Mau Mau movement, a label the British had stretched to cover everything they feared about African nationalism. The trial opened under the dry hum of ceiling fans and the sharp smell of inked paper. British officials in white uniforms filled the front rows. Behind them, African guards stood stiffly, their eyes fixed on the accused. A few local spectators carefully screen-watched from benches. The presiding magistrate, R.S. Thacker, had been flown in from Trinidad. The prosecution, led by Eric Griffith Jones, claimed to have proof that Kenyatta had sworn Mau Mau oaths and directed violence against loyalists. The evidence came from witnesses whose stories shifted like sand. Some were former detainees offered leniency. Others were government informers rehearsing lines that barely held together under cross-examination. Kenyatta's lawyer, the British barrister D.N. Pritt, exposed contradiction after contradiction, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The colonial government needed a conviction more than it needed truth. Pritt's defense turned into something deeper than legal argument. He began to describe Kenya's history in human terms: the theft of land, the humiliation of labor, the denial of education. His words reached the newspapers in London and New York, forcing distant readers to ask why a man preaching political dialogue was being tried as a terrorist. The British authorities, nervous of the attention, tightened access to the court and censored coverage. But by then, the story had already spread. Outside the courtroom, the colonial machine moved in rhythm. Helicopters patrolled the highlands, villages were screened, and thousands of Kikuyu men and women were detained in new camps. The logic was brutal: punish the body to contain the idea. But even in chains, Kenyatta's posture was calm. Guards described him as disciplined, polite, almost detached. Too many, that quiet defiance became its own kind of message. When Kenyatta finally spoke, his voice was steady, deep, and deliberate. "I have never been a Mau Mau," he said, "and I do not need to apologize for the struggle of my people." The interpreter's echo carried through the courtroom. The magistrate's pen did not pause, but everyone in that room felt a small tremor of something that did not sound like submission. In April 1953, the verdict came as everyone expected: guilty. Kenyatta and the others were sentenced to 7 years of hard labor. The British administration congratulated itself. The governor sent cables to London saying order would soon return. But order did not return. Instead, the rebellion deepened. The forests of the Aberdares filled with fighters who carried oaths and songs, and the word Uhuru became a greeting, a farewell, and a promise. Back in Kapenguria, Kenyatta began serving his sentence under heavy guard. The prison compound was small corrugated roofs, a dirt yard, a few vegetable plots. Guards rotated shifts to avoid contamination, but within months, reports began filtering out. Kenyatta was teaching. He organized study circles, discussed self-governance, and even advised warders on improving rations. What the British had built as a cage slowly became a classroom. Letters smuggled out reached Nairobi. "Mzee is strong," they said. "He reads. He waits." The name Mzee Old Man became his new identity. It was affectionate, reverent, and strategic. Kenyatta no longer needed a podium or microphone. His image grew from rumor and respect. The prison walls turned into a symbol, and every whisper of his entrance became a small act of defiance. By 1954, even British officials privately admitted that Kenyatta's removal had not broken the movement. It had crystallized it. The state could arrest bodies, but it could not arrest belief. Every camp, every detention center, every raid produced more men and women who saw their suffering as part of the same story that began with his name. From Kapenguria, Kenyatta watched as the colonial order began to show cracks. Newspapers abroad questioned the brutality of Britain's civilizing mission. Missionaries wrote letters of protest, and in Kenya's cities, young organizers, many of whom had never met him, started calling themselves his students. The British thought they had buried him in silence. Instead, they had given him a pulpit. The Mau Mau War and the spirit of Uhuru, the Aberdare Range, mist clung to the ridges like breath on cold glass. Beneath the canopy, a group of fighters crouched around a flickering fire, their rifles wrapped in burlap, their faces painted with ash to break the outline of skin against leaf and moonlight. They whispered stories not about their families or farms, but about Nzi, about how he was alive, imprisoned somewhere in the far reaches of the colony. About how he would return, while Kenyatta sat behind wire at Kapenguria. The land he loved was burning. The British called it a state of emergency. To the Kikuyu, who took oaths in the forest, it was war. The Mau Mau Rebellion was never a single army. It was a collection of fighters, farmers, and outlaws bound by a shared wound, the loss of land and dignity. Their weapons were old Enfields from the Second World War, stolen from armories, or homemade guns welded in secret. Their food came from sympathetic villagers who risked everything to feed them. Their hope came from the idea that freedom was not just possible, but inevitable. From the British side, the response was total. By 1954, more than 20,000 colonial troops and local auxiliaries had been deployed. Planes dropped bombs over forests, villages were fenced into protected areas that were little more than open-air prisons. Night raids became routine, curfews silenced markets and schools. The British believed they were restoring order, but every sweep created new rebels. Whole families were uprooted. Young men who had never held a weapon before fled into the forest. And even as the physical struggle grew bloodier, the moral one deepened. Was it freedom or survival they were fighting for? In the city, the British press wrote of savagery and terror, describing the Mau Mau as fanatics. But those who lived through it remember something more complicated. The oath ceremonies were not madness, they were solidarity. The secrecy was not bloodlust, it was protection. Each oath was a thread weaving a people into one fabric, one identity, after decades of being divided and ruled. And through all of it, Kenyatta's silence echoed louder than any speech. Each time a British official declared that the rebellion was decapitated, another village whispered that Nzi still led them, somehow, through spirit, if not through letter. In the camps, detainees sang songs that mixed prayer with prophecy. Mzee Kenyatta, we are waiting, we are fighting, we will not stop. The colonial government tried to erase his name from the press, banning photos and public references. But the harder they tried to suppress it, the more powerful the legend became. Children born in the early 1950s grew up hearing that Nzi was the father of freedom, a man who had spoken to kings and defied empires. Meanwhile, British officers wrote reports, thick with numbers, villages screened, suspects detained, rebels killed. But none of those statistics measured the one thing they couldn't control: belief. By 1956, the rebellion was crushed militarily. Dedan Kimathi, one of the forest generals, was captured and executed. The forests grew quiet again, but it was the quiet of exhaustion, not defeat. Kenya had changed. The oaths, the songs, the blood they had forged something unbreakable. In the years that followed, the British administration began to realize that victory in battle did not equal victory in spirit. A new generation of African leaders, many inspired by Kenyatta's earlier teachings, began to push for constitutional reform rather than rebellion. The tide was turning from violence to politics, but the goal was still the same: Uhuru. And somewhere far away, behind a fence and a watchtower, Jomo Kenyatta waited. He received fragments of news through guards and sympathetic officials. He heard of Kimathi's death, he heard of villages burned, of families scattered. But he also heard whispers that the British Parliament was starting to ask questions. That maybe, just maybe, the winds were changing. By 1959, the colonial government faced a truth it could no longer ignore. Kenya's future could not be built on fear. The detention camps had become a global embarrassment. And Kenyatta, The man they had tried to erase was now the only person who could hold a fractured country together. The empire that had once declared him a terrorist now needed him as a statesman. Kenyatta's release and the birth of a nation. August 1961. Lodwar detention camp. A low sun hung over the Turkana plains, painting the sand in gold. Inside the camp's gates, Jomo Kenyatta stood quietly as a group of guards prepared his transfer papers. For the first time in nearly 9 years, the man once branded as the leader to darkness and death was about to step back into the open world. His hair had grayed, his frame had thinned. But his presence had only grown heavier, like a mountain that had learned patience. The guards, who once looked at him as a dangerous symbol, now spoke to him with quiet respect. In the still air, a sentence passed between them without words. The world had changed. Outside, news of his release spread faster than the colonial administration could contain it. In Nairobi, people poured into the streets. Women all elated, men beat drums and lifted their fists. Buses painted his name on their sides, Kenyatta and I wet you, Kenyatta is ours. But the British government was cautious. They didn't set him free entirely. He was placed under restricted residence in Maryland, watched closely by security officers. Still, to the people, it didn't matter. Mzee was out. The waiting was over. When Kenyatta finally returned to public life in 1961, it was to a land transformed by struggle. The Mau Mau uprising had left deep scars, tens of thousands dead, countless displaced, but it had also forced the colonial authorities to negotiate. African representation in government was no longer a question of if, but how soon. Kenyatta's re-entry into politics was calm, but electric. When he stepped onto the balcony of a meeting hall in Nairobi, the crowd below erupted in a sound that felt like history catching its breath. His speech was short, deliberate, and forgiving. He called for peace, for reconciliation, for unity. "We do not want hatred between black and white," he said. "We want to build one Kenya." Those words surprised even his former captors. They expected anger. What they got was strategy. Kenyatta knew that freedom without peace would be hollow, that the path to independence required not revenge, but reconstruction. Through 1962 and 1963, he led negotiations in London, walking the same halls where, a decade earlier, officials had signed his imprisonment orders. Now they shook his hand. The Lancaster House conferences defined Kenya's future: majority rule, constitutional government, and finally, independence. On December 12, 1963, Nairobi stood still. The Union Jack came down. The Kenyan flag rose in its place, black for the people, red for their blood, green for the land, and white for peace. A new anthem played, voices trembling in disbelief and pride. Jomo Kenyatta, the man who had entered history as a prisoner, now stepped forward as the Prime Minister of a free Kenya. That night, fireworks lit the city. Across the country, bonfires glowed in villages that had once whispered his name in fear of arrest. Children were told stories of how Mzee had been taken, how he had waited, and how the people had never stopped believing. Independence didn't erase the pain of the past. The land question remained unresolved. The divisions planted by decades of colonial rule lingered. But something irreversible had happened. Kenya had seen itself united and awake. In his first months in power, Kenyatta's message stayed consistent. Harambee, he said, pulled together. He called for rebuilding schools, roads, and farms, for healing what war had broken. The very word that had united rebels in the forest was now written into the fabric of a nation. From the outside, it looked like the empire had granted independence. But anyone who had lived through those years knew better. Freedom hadn't been handed down, it had been taken, built, and paid for by courage. And the man Britain thought would destroy Kenya had instead given it shape. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember that freedom anywhere is never inevitable, it's earned. Subscribe for more untold histories that shaped nations, and share this story so others remember how Kenya rose stronger when the world expected it to fall.